Woe betide the poor soul who pisses off Moon Knight, because I'll tell you right now, by the time he gets done with you, you'll be wishing for death. So, this is Moon Knight Fist of Khonshu, and this is the Leaving Home story arc, Volume 1, basically. What this does is this initially picks up with some poor soul telling Moon Knight he can't come into a building because there's a dress code. And of course, Marc Spector's response, impossible, I'm dressed to kill. But what ends up happening when he literally sends the guy flying through the door and starts making his way down into this building is it switches over to a conversation between these two individuals. And this person says, if you're asking if he's back, if he's walking these streets like he owns them, if he's cracking skulls and striking terror, if he's got everyone spit scared all over again, then Moon Knight is back. And that's where you switch over to these people who are having this conversation in a diner, right? And this woman asks, just like that, right? And this guy's like, what, are you new? Yeah, Frazier, just like that. Now, this woman's got blonde hair. Her name is Frazier. She is not Marlene Frazier. For those of you guys who are Blue Marvel fans, I thought the same thing. I had to verify just to be sure. But he says, I did Freak Beat a long time, right? These guys, these capes, they never stay dead for long. But Moon Knight, the real one, forget about it, right? I've known him for a while, and nothing keeps this guy off the streets. And she asks, right? She says, you don't see how this creates a problem for the department, Flint. Maybe mass vigilantes are not illegal anymore, but we have a crazy guy out there growing his stable. And that's where Flint just says, good luck with that, right? What, like, is SWAT gonna go in and pull him out of his midnight mission? You go in there uninvited, and you do not come out. Now, a couple things to catch up on. For those of you guys who are new to the Moon Knight mythos with Jed McKay, the Midnight Mission is quite literally Moon Knight's base of operations, and it's a sentient building. So when he says, if you go in there uninvited, you don't come out, that's a literal statement. And it's not because Moon Knight will beat you to death. I mean, it's entirely possible he will. It's a coin flip. But it's also because of the fact that the house will devour you and kill you. It's absolutely crazy. It's one of these really weird, but also awesome concepts. Now, of course, the idea of them talking about, vigilantes being illegal, that was all Devil's Reign. Kingpin basically setting things up in the city of New York when he was mayor so that being a vigilante was illegal within the city of New York. But where the two of them kind of go back and forth about this idea that, like, Moon Knight's been killed, Moon Knight's been taken care of, that kind of thing. Ultimately, Flint just tells Frazier, that's not how it works with this guy, right? When it comes to Moon Knight, he says he's a force of nature, a hurricane. And a hurricane, you get out of the way and sweep up the broken glass after it's moved on. And that's where Frazier kind of calls him out, right? Like, maybe that's why you're not police anymore, Flint. And he says, that's exactly why I'm not a cop anymore, Frazier. Like, are you deaf or something? Because for the most part, with the exception of precious few, virtually all superheroes in New York follow a code, right? The Avengers, the heroes for hire. But when it comes to someone like Marc Spector, even the Punisher gives this guy a wide berth, right? I mean, this dude is absolutely insane because while they're conversing over whether or not Marc Spector is someone that needs to be dealt with, he's actually making his way through this building and taking out every single guy in this club. And so even when she's going over his associates, right? Reese and Soldier, who were introduced during Jed McKay's initial run, they're both basically vampires. Hunter's Moon, who turned out to be another agent of Khonshu that we'd never heard of before. Tigra, who's been around for a long time and is more recently associated with Marc Spector. 8-Ball, right? A Z-list villain at best, but who's also an associate of Spector. It's one of these things where he's brought all these people together for the Midnight Mission. But as Mark goes through here and takes these guys out, that's where Flint starts to realize he's not really being consulted, which is what he expected. He's being questioned. He's being treated like a suspect. And so it starts to piss him off because ultimately he just gets irritated and storms out of the place. And he just tells Frazier, right? Like, I'm not one of your snitches. Like, yes, I'm associated with Marc Spector, or at least he and I know of each other. But if what you're expecting me to do is to somehow inform for you about Mark, that's not going to happen. And so once you switch back to Mark getting through this entire place, all these henchmen are ordered to move out of the way because this voice comes out of nowhere and says, don't you know who you're talking at? That is Mr. Moon Knight, and he's a very important person indeed. And this guy introduces himself, right? He says, Achilles Fairchild, and this here is Carver. Please sit. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, Achilles Fairchild, there's a lot more going on to this guy than you think there is. And in fact, this dude is amazing because on the surface, he doesn't seem like a big deal. He seems fairly innocuous, right? He says, if I'd have known that you were coming, I would have put your name on the list, right? Save all the unpleasantness. Can I offer you a drink, Moon Knight, or perhaps a party favor? And that's where he's just like, no, right? And Mark just hands a little baggie, which is clearly a banned substance, essentially. And that's where Achilles asks, right? Like, it would appear that you have exotic tastes indeed. Now, I'm a simple country boy. What do we have here? And Mark just tells him, right? It's a drug, Fairchild, actual fairy dust. They call it glitter on the streets. And it's not from around here, not even close. But Mark's showing up here almost rhetorically. Any question that he asks Fairchild, you can largely assume he already knows the answer, specifically the whole context of this situation. And he really reveals his hand here, right? Because where Achilles talks about, I don't really know what this is, the response of Mark, let me tell you how I've spent my week, Fairchild. It seems that people have been selling glitter in my territory, and it's extremely addictive, more than anything earthly pharmaceuticals are capable of. Users turned into loyal addicts in record time, which means that very quickly, they don't have a choice other than turning to crime to maintain a habit that they cannot kick, which means that whoever's supplying the glitter controls a larger and larger group of people desperate for a fix. And this city's one supplier is you. And that's where Fairchild doesn't really deny it. And he's like, addiction, right? Ugly stuff. But I get the feeling that you know a thing or two about addiction, Mr. Knight, don't you? And he asks him, what's your poison? Drink, smoke, women, powder and pills? And Moon Knight just kind of leans in and looks at him and just says, violence. And that would be enough for me to be like, okay, cool. We'll stay out of your territory. I don't know if I'd want to piss off a guy like that. But ultimately, Fairchild doesn't take him seriously, right? He was like, you were probably a boxer at one point, right? Moon Knight's like, yeah. And he's like, are you any good? Because I bet you were, right? I bet you were the devil himself in the ring, not taking any of this conversation seriously at all. And so ultimately, Moon Knight kind of gets fed up. And he just says, like, you're a gangster, Fairchild, a pusher. You're selling magic drugs that are destroying people. And so Fairchild just kind of asks, like, what if I am, Mr. Knight? What are you going to do about it? And Moon Knight just tells him, like, I will kill you. And so Fairchild just kind of stares him down, finds the whole thing entertaining, and just says, the devil himself, you and I really ought to step into the ring sometime. And he says, but I keep my hands clean these days, Mr. Knight. That's what Carver is for. She was Roxxon corporate military, special forces, only one of her unit to survive a combat mission into some place called Vanaheim, even brought back a souvenir. The sword she has is dope, right? And we'll actually learn about that here in a minute. But ultimately, Moon Knight just ends up leaving because he realizes this guy isn't concerned about him at all. But the truth is, Moon Knight doesn't really take him that seriously either, or at least he doesn't really consider him to be a credible threat, just a guy to deal with at some point in time, only for us to find out that once Frazier leaves after talking to Flint, she's actually on glitter, and she's a dirty cop working for Fairchild. And so, of course, this leads Marc Spector to the Impossible City, the current base of operations for the Avengers. He meets with Tony Stark, but the problem with this is that Tony Stark's not a biochemist. He says as much, right? He's like, look, I'm an engineer. I don't really know much about this kind of stuff. At least I can't tell you anything that you don't already know. And he's like, you could talk to Reed Richards, but the truth about it is that Reed Richards is into biochemistry, but the reality is he can't really give you a whole lot of answers either. The only person that you could really talk to is a person that specializes in understanding chemical composition, just like this. That Tony tells him, I mean, it's got magical properties in some capacity, but Hank Pym's the guy you want to talk to. The problem with this is that the Marvel Universe believes that Hank Pym is dead. That belief largely stems from Rage of Ultron and the whole Ultron-Hank Pym merger. There was a storyline that took place called Avengers Incorporated, which we'll actually talk about here in a little while. It was a pretty cool story, but it kind of deals with the whole idea of Hank Pym. What matters is that following this meeting and the realization that the only one he can get information from is seemingly dead, Marc Spector kind of goes back out onto the streets again, doing his normal beat, and ends up coming across a couple of guys who are basically running glitter through the city, but one of them's got a gas mask on. Now, this is going to be an amazing reference, because what ends up happening is, of course, Moon Knight appears in front of these guys, only to find out the whole thing's a setup. 8-Ball's there, he just like sends the car flying and that kind of a thing, but these criminals are seemingly taken out, only for one of them to emerge, the guy in the gas mask. And Marc Spector doesn't recognize this guy, even though this guy tells Mark, you should know who I am. But it's the fact that he's wearing a different outfit than he traditionally occasionally wears, that Marc Spector can't keep up with it. And so what ends up happening is this guy basically takes his outfit off and is this exceedingly exotic looking figure. And that's when Marc immediately realizes it and says, it's Cubist. Now, Cubist is this super obscure character. Cubist was originally introduced in the Terry Kavanagh run of Moon Knight, back in Marc Spector Moon Knight issues 52 and 53. Technically, he only appeared in like a couple of pages in issue number 52, and then a couple more in issue number 53. The long and short of it with Cubist is that he's kind of similar to like the Purple Man in the sense that he emits pheromones, but instead of dominating the wills of other people, he actually twists their perceptions of the world around them. So no one really actually knows what Cubist looks like, because the pheromones aren't necessarily under his control, hence the reason why he was wearing the gas mask and the suit. As soon as that came off, the pheromones emit, and there's really nothing you can do. In fact, I don't even know that we actually have an origin for Cubist in Marvel Comics. He's that obscure, but Moon Knight recognizes him enough to understand the credible danger that he poses. And so initially, where Marc Spector and Hunter's Moon face off against this guy, at least in an effort to defeat him and then find out any information that he has, the reality is that he can't, but he does divulge some pretty important information here, in that he says, here's the first part, right? And then hits Moon Knight, says, here's a second, hits him again, and then says, and the third, Fairchild wants you to know that you forced his hand, coming after his business like this. So now he's going to come after your business. Everything after this, you bought and paid for. Now, the thought of killing you three did cross my mind, but Fairchild wouldn't like it. That, and I'm not so sure that you wouldn't manage to get your hands on me before I broke your skull or punctured a major organ. And now I know enough to know that if that happens, I'm dead, and seeing as my guys are gone, I should be as well. So the reality here is that it was a distraction just designed to send a message. It was a setup, right? Create a whole scenario that Moon Knight will definitely respond to just to send a message to him. Everything that happens next, you brought on yourself. And so once Moon Knight and Hunter's Moon and 8-Ball get back to the Midnight Mission, there's actually this really interesting aspect where Marc Spector starts to have this conversation with Tigra. But while he's having that conversation with her, the cops are showing up on the scene because Frazier's on the take. She's a dirty cop. One of the things that Marc Spector tells Tigra is that Hank Pym is actually alive, but it's a really weird and wonky situation, because when he tells her this, he also refers to this idea that Hank Pym is the father of her child, William, which is technically true, but technically not. The child that Tigra had with Hank Pym was actually a Skrull disguised as Hank Pym using Hank's DNA during the Avengers Initiative program, right? So the whole secret invasion event. So it wasn't truly Hank Pym, but it kind of is. But for Tigra, it's a huge revelation, because the death of Hank Pym represented the death of her child's father, even if it wasn't necessarily a literal thing. It's not a major plot point to the story, but it is a huge revelation for Tigra's character, because one of the things that Mark talks about is that his concern was that if he had told her during the whole Black Spectre event, so essentially the story arc that led to Mark dying before the events of Blood Hunt, when he ultimately ended up coming back, that if he had told her that, her head wouldn't have been in the game, and it would have gotten her killed. I mean, it makes perfect sense, right? You just suddenly find out that the father of your child, who you thought was dead, wasn't actually dead. It kind of changes everything. Even now, Hank Pym isn't necessarily Hank Pym, but that's a bridge that we'll cross at a different point in time. That's not really for this video. The main point here is that once the cops make their move on the Midnight Mission, then of course you would expect Marc Spector and the rest of the Midnight Mission to essentially put a halt to the cops, because Mark knows enough to know these guys are being directed based on the orders of a crooked cop. What they don't account for is Carver, because Carver ends up drawing Gunnar. Now, Gunnar is this massive sword that she got from Vanaheim, and it can actually change size. What makes the sword so capable, historically speaking, is that it has the ability to take the souls of the people it kills, but it also possesses magical properties. And while we don't get the full extent of what it's capable of in this story, we do find out that one of the things that it can do is literally kill the Midnight Mission. Like, it kills the essence of the building itself. So now it's just a building with 4 walls. And Marc Spector takes it as a personal loss. Very much a personal loss. Because one of the things to know is that when it comes to Moon Knight, he doesn't bring a lot of people or even things into his life. But when he does, they have significant value to him. And while the house was just a house as far as anybody else was concerned, unless they were foolish enough to invade it, right, and violate both the house and Marc Spector's space, for him, the house chose to protect them. It chose to keep them safe. So it was as much a member of the Midnight Mission as anybody else. And so once Frazier gets in here and starts ordering everybody to put their hands on the ground, Marc snaps. He's like, what did you do to the Midnight Mission, right? And she just says, on the ground now. And of course she says that because she's a fool and has no idea what she's gotten herself into. Because Marc says, you've killed my home and you killed my friend. And she says, don't be stupid, Moon Knight. And that's where he says no, right? Take him, Soldier. And Soldier jumps in and starts attacking everybody. I mean, he's got vampiric strength. This guy's incredibly fast and incredibly capable. The problem is they're talking about taking on all these cops. And anybody who knows anything will tell you, if you go after a room full of cops, it's only a matter of time before every cop in the city is on you. And so ultimately, it's a silly thing to do because Marc's fighting out of anger here, right? When Soldier asks him, like, what's the plan? Marc just says, they came into our house and killed one of us. Punish them, i.e., kill them all. And that's where Tigra's like, we cannot fight the whole police force. We have to get out of here. And Marc has every intention of killing Frazier, right? And he says, they started it. And she just begs him, right? She was like, don't. And he says, why shouldn't I, Detective Frazier? The junkie, murdering, dirty cop. But all the members of the Midnight Mission tell him, we can't do this, right? If we nix a cop, we're literally going to have the entire police force after us. And it's not going to be them coming after us to like arrest us or whatever the case is for their motivation being here. No. They're going to be out for blood, right? They're going to be out to kill us the first chance they get. And the Avengers, the Fantastic Four, even the X-Men, no one's going to be able to protect us because as far as the city's concerned, we're going to be people who take out cops. That's not cool, man. That's one line that no one in the Midnight Mission is willing to cross. Even Marc himself is just like, yeah, okay, we have to get out of here. And that's where he just tells them, right, you made a mistake coming here. And they take out every single cop. They don't kill them or anything, but they do beat them all unconscious. And he just says, we have to keep moving. And so they bail out as fast as they can. Now, the Midnight Mission, as he specifies, originally had a particular form. When it became the Midnight Mission, it adopted a secondary form following its quote-unquote death at the hands of Zodiac. But what it does is it reverts back to the original form. Why does that matter? Because Marc understood the building inside and out. There were different exits that could be used. And that's what he ends up taking, right? He and the Midnight Mission basically go underground and bail out into the city. And so what ends up happening is they end up going down into the sewers below New York. And they end up basically taking up residence in what's a decommissioned shield station. Now, this is actually a reference to Moon Knight #1 from Warren Ellis. There was actually a guy down here named Slasher, whose corpse is still down there. Slasher was like a former shield agent or something like that. Basically, he was injured by like a roadside bomb. And so when no one would do anything to help him fix his body, he almost kind of existed like Mole Man. He would just stay down in this decommissioned shield station and then occasionally go to the surface and just ambush people and then bring them down there and start taking them apart piece by piece and then using like their muscles, ligaments, or whatever and adding them to himself. He was literally Frankensteining himself. It was wild. It was a really, really crazy moment from the story. But one of the big things that Moon Knight and Tigra and all them are trying to figure out is why the cops are after them in the first place. Yes, they know what's going on with Fairchild, and yes, they know Fairchild is behind it, but at the end of the day, there's no warrant for their arrest. There's no reason for the cops to come after them. They haven't broken any laws. And so that's when Marc fires up the TV after he gets it to work, and it turns out, based on the false information provided by Frazier, Marc Spector and the Midnight Mission are basically being labeled as drug runners, the suppliers of glitter throughout the entire city, that they're deemed armed and extremely dangerous. Now, of course, the question you might be asking here is, why don't the Avengers or anybody's respond and help out Marc Spector here? Because it's Moon Knight. He's pissed everybody off. Nobody wants to have anything to do with Moon Knight. And I imagine most superhero teams out there probably wouldn't be too upset about seeing Marc Spector toss into the slammer or some kind of a padded room, right? Just throw him in the loony bin and throw away the key. But at that point, we switch back over to Frazier, who's going through and trying to find information from anybody who knows Marc Spector, including Dr. Sturman. Now, Dr. Sturman was basically introduced as Marc Spector's therapist within Jed MacKay's initial run. But it's kind of a funny thing, because what we learned fairly on is that Sturman is not a pushover, right? Sturman's not someone you can just kind of strong arm into doing what you want to do. And she shows that here, so much so that Frazier starts to realize, hey, I've bit off more than I can chew. Because she tells Frazier, I've been shot at by the scourge of the underworld, Detective Frazier, which I tell you only to establish a baseline. If you think your police posturing is going to cause me to break doctor-patient confidentiality, you are going to have to become significantly more frightening. And that's when Frazier says, I can do that. And Dr. Sturman just says, unlikely. Not unless you cross a line that you haven't yet. I'm not Moon Knight. My name is not so easy to drag in the mud, not with my connections. You're a cop? I was a federal agent. I rode with V Battalion. You know the commissioner? Rahoo. I know senators and Congress people. I was kidnapped by Zodiac. I was held hostage by Jigsaw. Detective Frazier, I regret to inform you that you are simply out of your league. And Frazier leaves, right? And realizing there's nothing that we can really do here. But again, she calls up Fairchild, kind of lets him know what's going on. And at that point, it switches back over to Marc, who's really just kind of trying to figure out what it is that they are going to do. And where he initially starts talking to his other personalities, right, Jake Lockley and Steve Grant, just trying to figure out, right, what their next move should be. Steve Grant's the billionaire, the business owner guy. Jake Lockley is the cab driver personality with his ear to the ground, always kind of knowing what's happening on the street level. The reality here is that Marc is just itching for a fight. This guy's pissed off to no end and just wants to punch something. And that's when the vermin pop up. Now, the vermin are not a major part of this, but they are kind of cool, right? The vermin from Jed MacKay's run are actually based on the original vermin character that was introduced during the story Kraven's Last Hunt. And in fact, this vermin was just kind of cloned. Again, it's not overly important. It just shows Marc Spector lashing out and just attacking everything in sight, because once his mind is cleared and all his rage is gone, then he can at least do something. But he actually kills, or seemingly kills, every single one of them. I mean, he's literally covered in blood. And so with all that out of the way, once Frazier gets back to her apartment, Marc's just waiting on her, right? And that's where she just kind of notices him there and just asks, like, are you going to kill me? And he just says, I haven't decided yet, Frazier, but I'd really like to. And she says, I'm a cop. And he's like, do you think that means anything to me? Right? Why not add cop killer to everything else you've put on my name? Which is true. If what Frazier was really hoping for is that by doing all of this, that she could somehow tell Marc, I'm a cop. And he's like, oh, well, in that case, well, let me just go home. Yeah, she has a whole nother thing coming. Marc Spector would kill her and be home in time for cornflakes, and he wouldn't think twice about it, right? He would have forgotten her name by the time he went to bed. That's how little this guy cares about whether or not she's a cop. And so that's where she just says, fine. Right? But I need to know, in the raid, you knew who I worked for. How? And he just says, because you were sloppy. That night you met with Flint and who you met after, one of my people was there. Now, the reality is that it looks like it was Jake Lockley, the Jake Lockley persona. That's the danger of Marc Spector. It's one of the things that makes him so cool, is that if you don't know about the Jake Lockley or the Steve Grant personalities when it comes to Moon Knight, that when you're at a diner having a conversation with a former cop and you're clearly a crooked cop, you don't know the guy sitting next to you is Marc Spector waiting on you. It's just one of the personalities that he has rattling around in his head. And so that's where Marc just asks, right, was it glitter, Frazier, or were you always dirty? And she just says, screw you, Moon Knight, like, you don't know me. I'm doing what I have to do. As long as Fairchild's got the glitter, I don't have any choices here. You try to kick that drug and you die. No medication, no therapy. Best case scenario is a coma. So if you've come to kill me, get on with it and quit wasting my time, because if Fairchild will not give me a fix, I'm dead anyway. And that's where Marc just says, call him. Right? I think it's time we had a chat. And so when Frazier calls Fairchild, initially he thinks it's her, but then Marc just tells him, hello, Fairchild. And Fairchild, again, not concerned at all, because I told you, there's a lot going on with this guy, right? And so Fairchild just says, this is great, right? Moon Knight, how you doing, boy? Right, again, not taking any of this conversation seriously. And Marc just says, I've been better, right? Do me a favor, tell your bodyguard that I'm going to kill her for what she did to the mission. And where Fairchild kind of mocks him a bit and asks the question, right, did you kill my cop? Marc just says, not yet, but it got me thinking. All this dancing around, taking pokes at each other's people, it's for the weak. You told me the night that we met that you were a fighter, a boxer, someone who fights face to face and eye to eye. And Fairchild just says, I did. And that I ought to get you in the ring sometime, see who the bigger man was. And Marc just asks, how about it? Right, let's settle this in the ring. You and me. You want my territory? I will fight you for it. Now, this is where the huge revelation comes, because what goes on here is that this fight basically kind of picks up in a boxing ring. It seems a little weird, but it's clearly an underground boxing match. It's not as though they set this whole boxing ring up in the middle of Central Park for the world to see. Not when Marc Spector is like public enemy number one right now. But before he actually goes out there and gets involved in this fight, he has this conversation with Khonshu where he says, you've brought me back from the dead a few times now, but it's never a fresh start, is it? I always come back with reminders, artifacts, like the symbol the Sun King's guys carved in my back, 357 punctuation from the Black Spectre, a kiss from stained glass scarlet. I come back from the dead, but my scars are always with me. Why is that? And Khonshu just says, because every scar is a lesson. Taken together, they are your education. In education, I will not allow you the luxury of forgetting. And so Marc says, then watch closely, Father, and let me show you what I've learned. And just walks out into the ring where Fairchild is waiting on him. And they kind of have a little banter back and forth, you know, quite a show. He's like, what can I say? I like to put on a show and yada, yada, yada. But once the fight actually kicks off, Marc's just like, ding, ding, and we're off to the races. And it's a knockdown, drag-out fight, right? Marc's literally throwing everything he has in this fight. And the Jake Lockley persona and the Steve Grant persona are watching all this go down. And they're kind of giving Marc a little bit of advice as this goes on, right? Jake Lockley says, do not give him time to think or to react. Go in for the kill as fast as you possibly can. Steve Grant says the same thing, right? He's bigger than we are and probably stronger. Keep him down. Bury him there. Make this ring his grave. They're not fighting to knock out. They're not fighting to break somebody's jaw so we can go into surgery. No. They're fighting to kill one another. And so Marc just says, right, quiet, right, tells Jake Lockley and Steve Grant to shut up and to let him work. And he tells Fairchild, I told you, right, I was going to kill you. And Fairchild just says, careful, Mr. Knight, you're liable to strain something. And just pops Marc off of his back with a flex. And Marc doesn't even know what to make of this. He's like, what in the world? And Fairchild just says, don't be mad, Mr. Knight. Not about a bit of sandbagging between friends. I want to do something nice for you, right? Let you get that winning feeling for one last time. And besides, I'm the curious sort. I just wanted to see how many horses you really had under the hood. And he just says, ding. And then it's his turn to take it to Marc Spector. And he absolutely does. Like, he crushes Marc. But the whole time, Khonshu starts chiming in his ear and he says, you have missed something, my son. Your rage and pride have blinded you. And Marc asks, right, what are you talking about? And Khonshu says, what do you know about your enemy? And he says, hillbilly gangster, right? Because in their first encounter, Fairchild had mentioned that he grew up on a farm, right? And Fairchild thinks that Marc's talking to him, right? You know, he's like, are you trying to hurt my feelings? And Marc just says, I'm not talking to you, right? He says, some smug hayseed farm boy made good, right? And Khonshu asks, what else? And Marc says, used to be a fighter, a boxer. And Khonshu just says, look to your body, my son, to the roadmap of violence carved in your flesh. And Marc says, scars. And Khonshu says, your education. And Marc says, he doesn't have any scars. And that's when Marc picks up, you have powers. If this guy was a former boxer, a former fighter, he would have scars, something to show that he had taken damage from other people over the years in the various fights that he's been in. And that's where Fairchild tells him, I do not, Mr. Knight, that would be cheating. And he says, I am what I told you I was, a farm boy, a simple son of the soil. But after he says that, his speech starts to change. And he says, in all my life, I was told I was not special, that I had to know my place, that the spires of gold and electrum in the shining city were meant for kings, for undying eternal royalty. But I never did tell you where that farm was, did I? I came so far to make my fortune here, all the way from shining Asgard. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end because Marc Spector is fighting an Asgardian. Like, imagine that, an Asgardian drug dealer in the city of New York. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.